Hey, seventh graders, how are you? Mr. Farley here, talking today about Chapter 5, Section 3, titled From Protest to Revolution. From Protest. Last section, we talked about protest in the colonies over taxation. Colonists were not happy about the new taxes after the French and Indian War, and they resorted to some pretty horrible ways of opposing. They were violent at times. They attacked tax collectors. They had peaceful protests as well, but they also mixed that with some violence and some outbursts that involved people getting hurt and even killed at the Boston Massacre, as we learned. Today, we're going to talk about how the protest moves from actual protest to the start of the American Revolution. And to start this off today, Chapter 5, Section 3, let's take a look at our three vocab words that appear on the list. Just looking at my list, there are 8 terms total in this particular lesson. 8 terms total, only 3 appear on this sheet. Please remember to study each of the 8 terms from this section. All the terms will appear on the Quizlet deck. We're only going to see 3 at the top of the reading. Let's look first at the first term, First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress was the meeting in Philadelphia of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. 12 of the 13 colonies will meet in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Second term is militia. A militia is an army of citizens who serve as soldiers during an emergency. An army of citizens who serve as soldiers during an emergency. Militia. And lastly is Minutemen. Volunteer soldiers who are ready to fight on a minute's notice. Volunteer soldiers who are ready to fight on a moment's notice. Militiamen. All right, so let's take a look at our reading of this section. In 1773, 3 years after the Boston Tea Party, 3 years after the Boston Massacre, take that back, the British passed the Tea Act. British passed the Tea Act, a law that taxed tea shipped to the American colonies. And the colonists believed that even though the law actually made tea less expensive, it was a trick to make them accept taxes passed by the British government. We'll talk about this more in depth in class, but the tax did actually make tea less expensive, but it also included a tax on the tea for the first time, and the colonists were not willing, did not go along happily with paying less for the tax or paying less for the tea because they believed they were hoodwinked or they believed they were tricked into paying a tax. In any event, colonists protested the tax with a boycott on tea and other actions. They protested the tax by boycotting, refusing to buy tea that was imported from Britain, and other actions, which we'll talk about again in class. Continuing on the night of December 16th, 1773, about a week before Christmas, a group of colonists boarded British ships in Boston Harbor. Working quickly, they dumped valuable British tea into the bay. This act, which we call the Boston Tea Party, outraged the British. It outraged Parliament, it outraged the King, it outraged British citizens. Britain responded. Britain acts very, very quickly by passing the Quebec Act, which set aside valuable Western land for French Canadians. The British Parliament also handed down a set of extremely harsh laws meant to punish the colonists for their protesting. These very harsh laws would be called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. They would be called the Intolerable Acts because quite literally they were laws or they were acts that the colonists could not tolerate. They were strict, a series of 4 very strict laws, which we will go over one by one in class. But these laws, these acts on the part of Britain were called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, again, because they were laws that the colonists simply would not and could not tolerate. In response to these intolerable acts, colonial leaders formed the First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress. made up of delegates from each of the 13 colonies. The colonies united and began to organize militias. Each of the 13 colonies began to organize militias, or groups of soldiers, okay, who are groups of citizens who could be ready to serve in an emergency if one were to happen. Clearly, with the formation of militias, when each colony begins to form their own militias, their own group of citizen soldiers, clearly in the backs of the minds of the colonists was the possibility, and it was as we move towards 1775, the possibility will become more and more likely. The colonies are preparing for war. And the colonists realize that war is going to be a possibility if things continue to escalate. All right. So the colonies begin uniting and begin to organize militias. Early in 1775, the British learned that Massachusetts colonists were storing weapons and ammunition at a depot west of Boston. On April 18th, British soldiers marched to capture the weapons. In the villages outside of Boston, the British fought groups of colonial Minutemen. They were on the way to capture these guns and this ammunition, and the British are going to fight a group of Minutemen, men who were ready to fight on a moment's notice. And at the battles of Lexington and Concord, we're going to see the very first shots of the American Revolution. We're going to see bloodshed. We're going to see colonists killed. We're going to see British soldiers killed and wounded at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And this is going to be the starting point of the American Revolution. It's going to be located at a point where the shot heard round the world is going to be fired. And we'll talk more in class and more as this unit progresses on what that term means, the shot heard round the world. Looking at the chart below the reading, chart is titled The American Revolution Begins. And this is a cause and effect chart. On the left-hand side are the causes of the American Revolution, causes of the events and the effects of those events, okay? And I'd like to just take a moment to look at each of these before we address the questions at the bottom of the page. I think this is important that we go over this. We're talking about causes and effects, how one thing leads to another, how one thing leads to another. Let's look at one cause. Britain passes the Tea Act. In the reading, we saw that took place in 1773. Britain passes the Tea Act, and the effect of that is the American colonists hold the Boston Tea Party. In December of 1773, the colonists decide that they're going to board British ships and they're going to toss literally hundreds of crates of tea overboard into Boston Harbor, tea that belongs to Britain. Okay, so one cause, Britain passes the Tea Act, and effect of that is going to be the Americans hold the Boston Tea Party. Another cause of the American Revolution, Britain passes the Intolerable Acts, which we read a moment ago, were four very strict laws after the Boston Tea Party. These are ways that Britain hopes to punish the colonies for their actions in Boston in December of 1773. And the effect of that, the First Continental Congress meets. The First Continental Congress is going to be an organization of delegates of each of the 13 colonies. They are going to meet in 1775, the First Continental Congress, in 1774, all right? And the third cause, in effect, Britain tries to capture colonial weapons. They march west from Boston in the early morning hours of April 18th, 1775. They are marching west to go to an armory, a building that they believe is housing colonial weapons and ammunition. And the effect of that is that the British and Americans engage in fighting at Lexington and Concord. These are all causes and effects that result in the beginning of the American Revolution. Causes on the left, effects on the right. And look how the arrow is kind of directing you toward each of the causes and effects. Let's take a moment to look at our questions now at the bottom of the page. Question 1 is going to refer directly to your reading above. Question 1 asks, why did colonists protest the tax on tea? Why did colonists protest the tax on tea? And what were some of those protests? Okay. Why did colonists protest the tax on tea? You can find the answer to that question directly above in your reading. Take a moment to please do that now. Now that you're done with question 1, let's take a look at question 2. Again, question 2 is going to relate to the chart. So you can find the answer to question 2 in the chart up above. In this area here, the area that we just spent a moment talking about, what occurred as a result of the Intolerable Acts? So it's asking cause and effect, what event would occur as a result of the Intolerable Acts? Please take a moment to answer question 2 by referring directly to the chart. And when we return, our next mini lecture will address the beginning of chapter 6, which is going to look at fighting beginning in the American Revolution in the North, in and around Boston. Much of the fighting in the first years of the American Revolution are going to occur in the New England colonies, primarily centering on Boston. And our first section of chapter 6, section 1, will address fighting beginning in the North. Chapter 6, section 1. We will see you guys next class. Study your vocab terms and make sure that you got them down cold. You can find them on Quizlet, and you can also find the terms for this lesson on your Google Classroom feed. Have a great day, 7th graders, and I'll see you next class.